Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'll be your host for the Living History program. Most of our listeners will know the Living History program tries to cover historical events and historical figures that have shaped our modern world. If you visit our website, www.voiceofislam.co.uk, you will see a variety of programs on the Living History program webpage, covering from Islamic history to Chinese history, Middle Eastern Broad Ancient history, and even European history. So today we're going to turn to Europe. Ancient European history is dominated by the civilizations of Greece and Rome, and the great conquerors linked to them, in particular the figures of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Modern Europe has also produced some amazing visionary leaders and great military strategists, including the legendary figure of Napoleon Bonaparte. For today's program, I am joined by my special guest, Professor Munro from the University of Bradford, and we will be discussing the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. Professor Munro is an award-winning historian and professor of modern European history at the University of Bradford, my great hometown. He specializes in the French Revolution and has published widely on the subject. His book, The Fall of the French Monarchy by Macmillan, which reassessed the French royal family's secret policy towards the revolution in a transnational context, won the 2002 Franco-British Society Literary Prize and was shortlisted for the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize and the Longmans History Today Prize. This was followed in 2007 by The Perilous Crown, France Between Revolutions, published by Macmillan. His latest book, Napoleon, The End of Glory, published by Oxford University Press, 2014, a reinterpretation of Napoleon's downfall up to 1814. His current book project is a study of the French Revolution in international context. So it's great to have Professor Munro with us. Just to set the scene before we bring him, I think it would be fair to say that at the height of his power, Napoleon dominated European and global affairs for more than a decade while leading France against a series of coalitions in the Napoleonic Wars. He won most of these wars and the vast majority of his battles, building a large empire that ruled over continental Europe before its final collapse in 1815. As the Emperor of France and one of the greatest commanders in history, his wars and campaigns are studied at military schools worldwide. He remains one of the most celebrated and controversial political figures in human history. So I think that sets the scene, Professor Price, quite well.
It does perfectly.
So welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. And perhaps we could start with the early life of Napoleon. How do you think the fact that Napoleon was originally Corsican shaped his attitudes and later career? After all, his father was a staunch Corsican nationalist who fought against the French.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Mohammed, it's a great pleasure to be here on Voice of Islam Radio and talking to you and talking about my big recent subject, about Napoleon. But yes, one must always bear in mind that Napoleon was Italian, of Italian stock, because Corsica had been part of the Republic of Genoa, the coastal Italian Republic of Genoa, for several centuries before the French monarchy conquered it, just the year before Napoleon was born, which was in 1769. Now, in certain very key ways, Napoleon remained outwardly quite Corsican, quite Italian. He always had a strong Italian accent to the end of his life. He wrote French very badly. He always made orthography and grammar mistakes in French. His first language, therefore, was Italian. But one point's important. Certainly being a Corsican meant that when he came to France as a boy to military school, he always felt himself to be an outsider. And that idea of being an outsider and somehow special as well stayed with him, of course, until the rest of his life. On the other hand, although his father had begun as a Corsican patriot fighting the French for Corsican independence, his father, very importantly, had quickly seen which way the wind was blowing when France took over the island, and it became clear that the French were here to stay, and his father, Carlo Maria Bonaparte, switched sides rather cleverly to ensure that his family, which was a minor noble family of Corsica, got the benefits of French rule. And it was through his father moving from one side to the other, to the French side of the Corsican conflict, that Napoleon got his first break, which was recognition of his nobility, of his family's nobility by the French government, which enabled him to be sent to a military school to get his first training in the French army when he was about 8. And being sent to the French mainland.
Obviously, in many ways, a very sensible and tactical move by his father. What was Napoleon's personal experience of the revolution? He was in the middle of it as a young person. What were his views on it, and did he support it in any way?
He did, yes. Bear in mind that by the time it broke out, he was 20. He was born in 1769. It broke out, as we know, in July 1789. By then, he was a young artillery officer at a small provincial garrison town called Auxonne in central France. And he supported, bear in mind, perhaps a little background on the revolution so we know what it was he was supporting. The revolution began when there was a rebellion, basically in the wake of a big financial crisis, against the French absolute monarchy, which led to not immediately a French republic, but a process of reform of the French monarchy, in which the king, Louis XVI, for 3 years stopped ruling as an absolute monarch and did rule uneasily with a revolutionary parliament, the National Assembly, as a constitutional monarch. Then, in 1792, largely because of various factors, revolutionary France went to war against most of the other European monarchies, which disapproved of the revolution. In the radicalisation and the chaos caused by war, the monarchy fell, the king and queen, as we know, were executed in 1793, and France became a republic. First a radical republic, with the Reign of Terror, under the rule of Maximilien Robespierre as head of the Committee of Public Safety. And then, once the immediate crisis of the war was over and France was no longer faced with invasion, Robespierre was overthrown, the terror ended, and a more moderate republican government, known as the Directory, came to power, which ruled from 1794 until 1799. Now, Napoleon's attitude towards all this is, bear in mind, he was always voraciously ambitious. He always thought he had a special destiny in a very fatalistic sort of way, which meant, of course, going with the authorities at the time so that he could advance himself and his destiny. So partly from belief, but also partly from ambition, he supported the initial reforms of the French Revolution, which were substantial: legal reform, religious reform, religious equality, equality before the law. When France became a republic, he also supported the republic. He went so far as to support the radical republican regime under Robespierre, but partly that was a product of personal advancement, because he became quite early on in the revolution a client of Robespierre's brother, who was also a powerful politician called Augustin Robespierre. And actually, because he was so identified with the Robespierre brothers, when the Robespierres fell, because the brother was executed in Paris along with Maximilien, Napoleon was arrested. He didn't come that close to being guillotined, but he fell from favour, and it took a number of quite clever political and military manoeuvres for him to come back into the good graces of the successor regime of the Directory.
Just out of interest, this term French Directory is somewhat a very different name to what we used to. What were they referring to? Is that it's the direction of the revolution, or how does the name come about?
Well, basically, the Republic never actually, in the First Republic, which lasted until 1804, in fact, because Napoleon was the last sort of chief executive of the Republic as first consul. The Republic was basically governed by a committee. Robespierre was never president. He was simply head of this governing committee known as the Committee of Public Safety. And when Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, which had blood on their hands because obviously they'd overseen the terror, the reign of terror in which thousands of people had been killed to keep the revolution going, the successor regime, still Republican, was also a committee, and it was a committee of 5 people. It sounds rather modern today, like directors of the board, directors of the company.
Yeah, that's what I was
exactly.
thinking. Yeah,
but they were known as the directors, the 5 directors. And they basically governed as a committee from 1794 until Napoleon himself overthrew them. And then governed in a committee of 3, known as the consulate, which of course was much more Roman, much more harking back to classical tradition. But for this period of 5 years, rather oddly to our ears, the governing body was this committee known as the Directory.
Okay, thank you. Now, before we get into the campaigns that led to Napoleon becoming a prominent national figure, perhaps you could just explain for our listeners who the other major European powers were in Europe at that time, because clearly the revolutionary government had to, fight various wars. So just set the scene for us who the major powers
Of course, yes. Well, basically, in April 1792, for various reasons, internal and external, France goes to war against the major European power, which, how shall I put this, which had been a great enemy, had become an ally of the monarchy in the last 30 years, but of which most French people were very suspicious. And that was the Austrian Empire, which obviously was Central Europe, based on Vienna, but had a border with France because Austria controlled what's now known as Belgium, and then was known as the Austrian Netherlands. And so there was a border which was always a flashpoint between Austria and France. Now, basically, the Austrian monarchy was a pretty well absolute monarchy. And as an absolute monarchy, a conservative monarchy, it was very suspicious of the reforms the French Revolution was undertaking and didn't want them to spread to Austria. So there's an ideological dimension to the clash between Austria and France. There were many other causes, but that was a major one. Right. The rest of Europe was governed by conservative absolute monarchies. The big one, actually, the most powerful on the continent, was Russia. Prussia was also very important as well. Prussia and Austria were the dominant powers in Central Europe, which was basically made up of a patchwork of amazingly 358 smaller German states, grouped in what was known, it's very complicated, grouped in what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. This was a medieval construct going back to the Emperor Charlemagne in 800.
Yes.
Dominated basically mostly by Austria, but Prussia coming up on the inside as a rival. The more constitutional systems are Holland, which is semi-republican, and of course Britain, which is beginning to become a global power, a maritime power, but not really a continental power. It has its continental influence through alliances with the main continental powers. Normally, it moves between Russia, Austria and Prussia. But basically,
in many ways, that was the uniqueness of the British Empire. They were able to play the whole world.
They played the whole world. Well, that's why the French called them a perfide Albion, perfidious Albion, treacherous England. Let's not go there. But basically, England got her say on the continent. and beat off all her continental rivals by playing them off against each other. That was the way that was the way they did it. Anyway, but basically what you've got by 1792, and certainly when the king, Louis XVI, is executed in January 1793, that sends a thrill of horror through all the European monarchies, because that's actually cutting off a monarch's head. The English had done it before with Charles I, but that was a long time ago. So you have this situation where the monarchs all feel personally threatened by the French Revolution, which for various reasons has declared first war on Austria, and then with the execution of King Louis XVI, all the other major powers they join Austria in fighting France in the so-called War of the First Coalition. So Russia doesn't at this point, but Austria, Prussia, northern Italy, Piedmont, Spain, England, they all join this big coalition against France.
So it's quite a challenge at the early stage for this embryonic revolutionary government.
It's enormous.
So obviously,
it's existential.
Napoleon's invasion of Egypt marked his first encounter with Islam. It also led to really his whole persona and sort of glorification as a national hero. So what was his attitude towards Islam and the Muslims, and why did he go towards those lands?
Okay, well, first of all, he went towards those lands because it was his pet project, but approved of by the Directory. It was a very geopolitical, as we were discussing before, it was a very geopolitical, canny, tactical move, military move. It was aimed against England. He decided the best way of forcing England to make peace with revolutionary France was to strike at the British Empire. The jewel in the crown, as you well knew, was British India. So he went to Egypt to cut the Suez link between Britain and India. That was the aim. It was a geostrategic military aim. Very bold indeed.
I mean, interestingly, it said that he tried to make alliances with Tipu Sultan, who was a major figure in India fighting the British at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Tipu Sultan of Mysore, again, on the principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yes.
And don't forget, of course, that the French had never forgiven the English for kicking them out of India at the end of the 7 Years' War. One of the key, the British Empire isn't founded in the 19th century. The British Empire, as a bit of a digression, is founded in 1763 with the end of the most successful war Britain ever fought against France, the 7 Years' War, when she gains Canada in the west and India, both from the French, in the east. And the French are only left with Pondicherry and little bits around the coast of India, and they always want revenge. And so again, the French cultivation of Tipu Sultan begins actually at the end of Louis XVI's reign, before the Revolution. And obviously, once France gets into war against England in the Revolution, the directors and Napoleon see Tipu Sultan as an excellent ally, and they form an alliance, and as part of that, Tipu Sultan does go to war against the British. He fulfills what the French want of him. He's defeated, of course, and killed at the Battle of Seringapatam, but in that sense, the French strategy does work. They get a Muslim Indian ally, yes.
What was their thought in relation to the Ottoman Empire? Because clearly the Ottomans were ruling that part of the Muslim world, including Egypt, etc.
Absolutely.
Well, allies or enemies?
That's very difficult. I mean, Napoleon was out for himself and for France, which basically identified with himself. Yeah. Obviously, Egypt under the Mamelukes had broken away. It was, of course, officially still part of the Ottoman Empire, but the Mamelukes had a great deal of, embarked, I'm no great expert, on a path of semi-independence. So Napoleon goes to Egypt, and he knows he's got to get, he's cynic, he knows he's got to get the population on his side. He tries to play the national card, the ethnic card, as it were, by
The
appealing,
Arab against the,
by appealing
the
to the
foreign.
Egyptians against the Ottomans and saying you've been oppressed and taxed by the Ottomans and by the Sultan, and France will give you liberty and national independence. That's the first thing. The second thing is, obviously, he has to show respect towards Islam. His own religious beliefs remain a mystery. He died a Catholic. He took the sacraments. He took the sacraments on his deathbed in Saint Helena, but he was probably an agnostic or a deist. Really, he probably was. I mean, it's very difficult to pin down his religious beliefs, but basically, he knew Islam was the dominant religion in Egypt, and he had to get it on side. So he issued many proclamations praising Islam. He referred to the Prophet Muhammad as a great, I quote, as a great man who changed the face of the world. He, on the feast day of the Prophet, I think the 23rd of August, 1798, he went to the Al-Azhar Mosque and took part in the commemorations and the celebrations of the Prophet's birthday, and he was given the title, I think, by one of the sheikhs as Ali Bonaparte. But on the other hand, we do have. So he certainly publicly expressed respect for Islam, but one of the key sources for his attitude to Islam are the memoirs of his secretary, a man called Bourrienne. Now, they've got to be taken with a pinch of salt, because Bourrienne later fell out with Napoleon, and the memoirs are not reliable. But if I just give you a quick quote, what Bourrienne said about Napoleon's attitude, which seems quite accurate from other things we know, he said Bonaparte's principle was to look upon religions as the work of men, but to respect them everywhere as a powerful engine of government. If Bonaparte spoke as a Muslim, it was merely in his character of a military and political chief in a Muslim country. To do so was essential to his success, to the safety of his army, and, of course, big thing, to his glory. In Tibet, he would have been for the Dalai Lama, and in China for Confucius. I think that sums up Napoleon.
Sums it up quite. Yeah. I think because we're heading towards our break for the first part, and there's a lot to cover. I know in the Western world, romance plays a big part in his relationship with his love of his life, Josephine. Yes. So we're going to have to cover that quickly. He married Josephine in 1796. There's a lot of drama and romance noted about this. Just tell us a little bit how important she was to him in his life.
She was unquestionably the love of his life. Allegedly, his last words were France, head of the army, and then Josephine. So Josephine was perhaps the last word he uttered. She was about 10 years older than he was. She was very beautiful. She was aristocratic, so she had a sophistication he lacked. Because of this, she'd almost been guillotined during the French Revolution. She'd come within a hair's breadth of the guillotine. She'd been married before. She had 2 children who Napoleon adopted as his stepchildren, who played a major role in the empire afterwards. She had affairs, he had affairs. It was a stormy relationship. She didn't have much of a political role. She certainly had a role as an arbiter of taste. She was a fantastic gardener. If you go to Napoleon's country house outside Paris, which I recommend, Malmaison, that was very much her house. She designed the gardens, which are still fantastic to this day. He did use her politically in one way. As an aristocrat, he used her to rally former aristocrats and former monarchists to his regime as part of reconciling French people to the regime. So she had her own court, her ladies-in-waiting. They all tended to be chosen for their aristocratic connections to rally them to the regime. Obviously, in 1810, he realised that she was now too old, to have children. By this time, he'd founded a dynasty. He'd become emperor of the French. He wanted a son. And so just like Henry VIII, really, with Catherine of Aragon, although he remained semi in love with her, with great regret, actually, he had to divorce her. And he then married a dynastic marriage.
I think we'll come to that later on.
But basically, he, with regret, he divorced her. But they remained friendly until her death in 1815.
We've got about 5 minutes for this first segment, so perhaps we could cover the... Do you think Napoleon can be called a military dictator? After all, he came to power through a military coup. What do you think?
That's a really good question, and it's part of the big controversy there's been, actually, because obviously all these last few years have been the bicentenaries of various of Napoleon's victories, of his becoming emperor, of Austerlitz and Trafalgar, and of course just a few days ago, which is marvellous that we're doing this interview today, the 5th of May, of course, was the bicentenary of his death on St. Helena on the 5th of May. And this is a big debate among historians at the moment for the bicentenary. Those who dislike Napoleon say, yes, he was a military dictator because he relied on the army. He used an army coup to come to power to overthrow the Directory in November 1799. On the other hand, historians who are more sympathetic to him, like Michael Breus, like Andrew Roberts, for example, would say no, because he didn't depend entirely on the army. He ruled by referendum, actually by plebiscite. All his major decisions, they say, were actually supported in referenda, some of them rigged, some of them not, by the people. He governed also with a parliament, with a three-chamber parliament that then became a two-chamber parliament. It didn't have much power, but he did feel he had to pay lip service to it. So it's a very delicate area to think, was he entirely just a military dictator? It's interesting that his downfall isn't when the army deserts him. The soldiers remain loyal to him. What finishes him in 1814 is when his generals, his marshals, a key number of them desert him. Now, in that sense, you can say he's brought down by a section of the army. But the key constitutional political thing that causes his downfall is when the upper house of his parliament, the Senate, deposes him, votes him down as ruler. So in that sense, he had to abide by constitutional decisions, and in some way, you could argue he was a semi-constitutional ruler.
This is probably a good place to have a break for our first segment, Professor Price, and we'll carry on in the second half. Hope listeners have enjoyed this so far. Just before we go on our break, just to remind you, please do give us your feedback on our Living History programs. Go to the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk, and under the program section, you will see all the different programs on SoundCloud for Living History. Our hashtag is @VILivingHistory, and you can feedback on Twitter as well. We'll be back shortly. Thank you.
The Voice of Islam, with live discussions, religion and culture. Understand the true teachings of Islam with the Voice of Islam.
So hello and welcome back to the second segment of the Voice of Islam Living History program. We were talking about the life and legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte with Professor Munro Price. So, Professor Price, in the last segment, we were just finishing off with Napoleon becoming the first consul, and really how people viewed him taking over the government. But he achieved quite a bit during this phase. Just take us through the key bits. For example, the centralization of the government, yes, the Napoleon Code, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is generally regarded as by historians today, as Napoleon's greatest claim to fame, because military victories are sort of ephemeral. What he did in his period as first consul, before he made himself emperor of the French, i.e. from 1799 to 1804, was certainly domestically the most constructive period of his rule in France. And it's what the French historians who are most sympathetic to him would call the Great Consulate, because what he does basically is he inherits a very divided country, because the revolution is terribly divided, terribly polarising. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed during the revolution, internally as well as during in the wars, which are still ongoing. And Napoleon knows actually that one of the main things that's caused the division is the religious split. The French Revolutionaries' very radical attempts to reform the French Catholic Church, even leading in some areas to the institution of atheism. And so he basically, one of the key things he does is he reconciles France with the Pope, the revolutionary government, the consulate with the Pope, with the Catholic Church, through an agreement known as the consulate, in which basically the Pope recognises the new government, and there's a deal made about who appoints bishops, basically. It's a sort of condominium between church and state. And that lasts until 1905, and actually for various reasons it still survives in one part of France on the eastern border, in Alsace and Lorraine. The Concordat still survives, and that meant that in a Catholicism was recognised not as a state religion, but as the religion of the majority of French people. That meant the other revolutionary legacy of religious toleration was intact. So Protestants, Jews, and the few Muslims in France enjoyed public worship and toleration. So that was very important. You also get the centralisation of France through a bureaucracy, the prefectural system. France divides into departments. That had happened during the Revolution, but Napoleon continues it. So centralisation from Paris, the fact that the French republican system today is a very centralised one, comes essentially from Napoleon. The other crucial legacy of Napoleon to France and to the world is the Napoleonic Code. The Code Napoleon, the codification of civil law, which is the basis of French civil law today, and enshrines the principle of equality before the law, and also is the basis today still of all property rights in France. And wherever Napoleon went, wherever his armies went, which is why in Europe and indeed the world, actually, the Napoleonic Code was introduced in Belgium, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain briefly. How far it went globally, he couldn't really introduce it in Egypt. But when you think that the greatest ruler of modern Egypt, apart perhaps from Nasser, Mehmet Ali, visibly inspired himself from Napoleon and introduced certain Napoleonic reforms, the effects of his domestic reforms have been felt beyond Europe.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 1802, Napoleon proclaimed himself consul for life, and that was really heading towards him becoming the French emperor. And this alarmed the rest of the powers, especially the British, tremendously. And again, although he had established some peace across the continent, but I think that was very short-lived. So just take us through this period of his relationship with Britain and the really ongoing wars now during this period, because there were major wars.
Yes. Bear in mind the period you're talking about, from 1792 to 1815, to Waterloo, therefore, is known as the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. You're talking about a series of wars, the various different shifting coalitions of the great powers, the monarchical powers fighting against revolutionary Napoleonic France, that goes on basically with a few breaks, but not many, for 23 years. So it's of the scale of the First World War and the Second World War for the period. It actually kills more people across Europe than the Napoleonic Wars, obviously over a longer period, over 23 years rather than 4 years, as in the First World War. But it's a cataclysm of the same type. Napoleon's great achievement is to achieve the one general peace in the Napoleonic Wars, if only just for a few months, in 1802, 1803. Okay. And this coincides with his most glorious domestic period. He has time to devote himself to France, to all these domestic reforms. But obviously, at various points during these wars, he is at peace with some of his enemies. Okay, at various points he is at peace with Austria. He makes a marriage alliance with Austria once he's divorced Josephine, which we'll probably come to later. He makes peace with Russia. He makes peace with Prussia. That's okay. The one power he has difficulty making peace with, and only does for this very brief period in 1802 to 3, the period of the so-called Peace of Amiens, is with Britain. And that's probably because Napoleon's ambitions are such that they are global, okay? And that's always going to bring him into conflict with the one genuinely global power of the period, which is powerful it's not just powerful on the continent, which is powerful all over the world, which is Great Britain. Also, of course, on the continent, he's a great threat, not just to the British Empire, but to Britain's own native soil, because his empire, by his conquests in his empire, by 1803, 1804, stretch right across that whole coast, facing the so-called narrow seas, the Channel coast, and the North Sea coast, directly facing Britain. His power in France and Europe, therefore, directly threatens Britain with invasion. So, from the moment he takes power, Napoleon is an existential threat to Britain. And that's why Britain is his most bitter enemy.
Tell us a little bit about this famous Battle of Trafalgar, which obviously Britain achieved great victory, and it's celebrated so much. Very briefly. Obviously.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Trafalgar is obviously along with Waterloo, one of the great British military victories. It is important under Nelson, of course, and bear in mind, Napoleon and Nelson, had form, basically, because it was Nelson who had really destroyed Napoleon's chance of success in Egypt by the Battle of Abu Qir, what the British call today the Battle of the Nile, had destroyed the French fleet that had taken Napoleon to Egypt, which meant, of course, he was trapped. He couldn't go back. So Nelson had destroyed Napoleon's hopes of repatriating his army once he'd cut communications with Egypt, and destroyed Napoleon's dream of Egyptian dominance. He re-emerges, obviously, as the key British admiral at Trafalgar. Trafalgar is in the context of a real invasion scare of Britain after the end of the Peace of Amiens in 1803. Through 1804, Napoleon has built this vast invasion fleet at Boulogne to invade England, and it's a hot war. There's a real chance Britain could have been invaded by Napoleon at that point, and if he had, who knows what would have happened. And so the British have to have this total naval blockade of the Channel, which they do very successfully, so that by 1805 there's no real threat of invasion of Britain from the Channel. The only way the French can therefore invade England is by commandeering the Spanish fleet. It's all rather complicated, and Spain is at that point an ally of England, and all the French fleets on the Atlantic coast, and sailing them up to the Channel. The British and Nelson stop this, okay, so that I'm not really a naval historian, but basically, so the French and Spanish fleets have to go back to port. And Napoleon, who understands nothing of naval strategy, he's totally land-based, he doesn't understand that. He thinks the only way to destroy the British fleet is for the Franco-Spanish fleet, which is then in Cadiz in Spain, to sail out and tempt the British fleet, the Royal Navy, to a naval battle. And if they beat Nelson and the British Navy, they'll then be able to sail back and join up with the Channel Fleet and invade England. The French Admiral Villeneuve knows exactly what will happen if he goes out and faces Nelson. Bear in mind, the one arm of the French military wrecked by the revolution had been, for various reasons, the Navy. It had never recovered. Okay. The officers weren't very experienced, the sailors weren't very good, the same thing had happened in the Spanish Navy, so they sail out and they get absolutely destroyed by Nelson. Now what that means is that even though the initial invasion scare of Britain had passed, France would need to rebuild an entire fleet to invade Britain again.
Essentially,
basically, there was no chance after that.
The British were really the masters of the seas, and the French got thrashed at most of the major sea confrontations. But on land, the French had a lot more success, and especially against the Austro-Russian forces. Just tell us briefly a little bit, and then we'll move on towards the Russian campaign, which proved to be an absolute disaster.
Bear in mind, Napoleon is a military genius. I don't think anyone would deny that. The great work on that from a British author is by David Chandler, who was the professor at Sandhurst. The Campaigns of Napoleon, that's the go-to book still for Napoleon as a military genius. Michael Breurs also is very good in his multi-volume recent history of Napoleon on this. Napoleon, what they both say, though, is Napoleon wasn't an original military genius like Alexander the Great, for example, or Caesar. He was building on major, major reforms in military thinking brought about during the French Revolution, particularly the introduction of conscription for the first time in modern history, which had enabled France to beat off the European powers from 1792 onwards by being able to field mass armies of 1 million plus, which the other countries simply couldn't do at that point. And because of these mass armies, they lived off the land. In the revolution, they developed the corps system, a system of moving much, much more quickly, because they didn't have big baggage trains of food and supplies than their opponents. And Napoleon inherits all these achievements and innovations, military innovations of the French Revolution, and applies them in his own way with extraordinary effect against the rather traditional, slow-moving, hidebound armies initially that oppose him. His first great campaign, which showcases him as a military genius, is on behalf of the Directory, as you mentioned earlier, I think, the Italian campaign against Austria of 1796 to 1797, the Battle of Rivoli, Arcola, Lodi, all these victories, which astound Europe, basically. So that's against the Austrians. Then he goes to Egypt. He has a return match against the Austrians in northern Italy, ending with the victory of Marengo in 1800. But Marengo, bear in mind, is a very close call. He's almost defeated. He only snatches victory from the jaws of defeat only at the end there. And then you get, of course, his glory period, the War of the Third Coalition, as you say, against Austria, Russia, not Prussia, Austria, Russia, and England. And these are his this culminates in his great victory of 1805, December 1805, against the Austro-Russian forces at Austerlitz in what's today the Czech Republic. This is a textbook military victory which uses various tactics and deception, actually, and the combination of centre attack and flank attack to destroy the Austro-Russian forces. On the other hand, you might say it almost sows the seeds for his downfall, because it does go to his head, I think. He does think after Austerlitz that he is invincible and can defeat anything that his enemies throw against him. Also, the peace treaty he signs with the Austrians afterwards, the so-called Treaty of Pressburg, extends French influence way beyond where it had been under the monarchy for centuries before, well into Central Europe, and in a way makes him think in terms of European, if not global, dominance, and therefore basically sets him up for a fall, because his ambitions start to become immeasurable.
Yes, this is the height of his power and glory, but as you say, things started turning. So can you point to the time and what actually, many say it was his extension into the Russian campaign, etc. What do you think?
It's very, very difficult. You could say it begins at Austerlitz. On the other hand, the military victories, like Jena against the Prussians, 1806, again against the Russians, Friedland, 1807, the string of military victories continues. On the other hand, he's starting to become a prisoner of overextension, I think, is what brings him down. I think the key thing, which is what the greatest modern French historian of Napoleon, Jean Tullard, argues, actually Britain brought him down, because he decided, in a very modern way, he couldn't invade Britain and defeat Britain militarily. He would use economic warfare against Britain. So he set up this thing in 1806 called the so-called continental blockade, or continental system. Basically a tariff barrier policed by troops and ships, basically blocking all British trade with the continent, trying to bring Britain to her knees. He famously said at this point, "I'll destroy Britain through her economy, because England is a nation of shopkeepers, only interested in their pockets." And so destroy Britain through economic warfare. Actually, it destroyed him. Britain had some tough times, but survived economically. What Napoleon did is he set himself this impossible task of sealing off the whole European coastline to British goods. It wasn't possible. And this forced him, says Tullard, and I absolutely buy this, it's a brilliant analysis of how Napoleon fell, really. He had to extend his empire, therefore, into countries that didn't want it, that had Atlantic or Mediterranean coastlines, and just meant over and over extension. The overextension meant that he wanted to bring Spain into his tariff, his single market, dare I say, to exclude British goods from Spain. This leads to the so-called Spanish ulcer, an invasion of Spain the Spanish never accept. They mount a very effective guerrilla warfare against him. They bring in the British under the future Duke of Wellington as their ally. This is Wellington's first exposure to the French in Europe, and ultimately against Napoleon later on. So it gives the British a foothold on the continent as well. And then, of course, it leads to his confrontation with another power that doesn't want to alienate Britain and mess up its own economy in 1812, and this is Russia. So the idea that you've got to reduce to subservience for economic reasons to incorporate them into your blockade against England, major countries, leads to this overextension, leads to military involvement and ultimate downfall.
So, Professor Price, what's the turning point then? Obviously, Napoleon had a lot of successes. Maybe power got to his head, but soon things started turning against him. Just take us through this phase, please.
Yes, of course. Well, the key thing, obviously Spain was a problem. The overextension of the continental system was the root cause of it. But then he falls out with Russia, and Tsar Alexander I, because Russia doesn't want to adopt the continental system and doesn't want to alienate Britain. So he invades Russia in June 1812 with the biggest army seen since the days of Alexander, 500,000 men, 600,000. And everything goes wrong because actually this time militarily he gets it wrong. Napoleonic strategy, based on revolutionary reforms, had always been based on provoking and forcing the opponent, the enemy, into a quick battle of annihilation. basically, what Clausewitz later called a battle of annihilation. A quick battle, a quick victory for political as much as strategic reasons. And the Russians knew this, and this is another important thing. From about 1808, 1809 onwards, Napoleon's enemies began to learn from his tactics, and they tended to avoid him, concentrate on his generals who weren't as good commanders as him, adapt their tactics. And the Russians knew they should not ever engage Napoleon face to face in a battle unless they absolutely had to, and use, as did Stalin against Hitler in the Second World War, use the vast spaces of Russia to disappear into them, to draw the French on, to have a scorched earth policy so that the French basically couldn't get the foodstuffs and supplies they needed. Also, very important in the Russian campaign, so that their horses starved and died, basically, so their cavalry collapsed. And so basically, the Russians only gave battle when they had to, and they finally had to in September 1812, when they gave battle to defend Moscow, because of PR, basically, they had to. And this was the Battle of Borodino. But Napoleon didn't win Borodino. It was a very, very bloody draw. So basically, when Napoleon occupied Moscow, he had basically lost, because the Russians basically, even though they had lost their capital, were not going to come to terms. And if they didn't come to terms, there was no way he could do anything other than retreat. As we know, I'll be very quick, he chose the wrong route back for his retreat, which is a huge military blunder, because he went back the way he'd come, where all the food supplies had already been exhausted. Obviously, the winter came early, and that played a part, but basically, it was the failures of his own campaign strategy that brought failure on his own head.
In March 1814, I think it was, when he went into exile on the island of Elba.
Yep.
Was this the choice of their enemies, the victors, or how was that agreed?
That was agreed, well, after Russia, he'd been forced back bit by bit through Europe to France. He'd been forced to abdicate by the Senate and some of his key marshals at Fontainebleau at the beginning of April 1814. The Allies, actually led by the Tsar, Alexander, were quite chivalrous towards him, and they gave him this tiny principality, of which, rather amusingly, this little island off the Tuscan coast, off western Italy, called Elba. They actually gave him this rather ludicrous title of Emperor of Elba, this very small island. But they treated him with respect and dignity and gave him some status. And very much that was to do with Tsar Alexander, who saw himself as a Christian hero and warrior, forgiving his enemies. The trouble was that the other European powers, who were rather more cynical than Alexander, were very upset about this, because they knew Napoleon's ambition. They knew he'd never be content just sitting on Elba, even if he was Emperor of Elba. And therefore he'd mount some sort of attempted comeback. And therefore Elba was much too close to the continental coast for him. So even before he left Elba to start the 100 Days, there were plans and moves to move him much further away to Europe. Even while he was on Elba, St. Helena was being discussed as a possible destination for him. And it's quite probable that he got wind of this, and this is one of the reasons why he escaped from Elba to mount the so-called 100 Days.
As you say, he did escape, and his campaign didn't last very long, 100 days or whatever. But of course, his final and big, really, downfall was brought at I read his humiliating defeat at Waterloo. Just take us through briefly, because we're really reaching the end of the time.
Absolutely.
And then we'll summarize.
Okay. Waterloo is a very difficult campaign. There's a whole issue of how physically or mentally ill Napoleon is by this time. He has certainly undergone a rapid physical decline from about 1810, 1811, whose causes are controversial. it maybe he had a hormonal disorder that made him much more sluggish and certainly made him much fatter than he had previously been. And certainly on the day of the Battle of Waterloo, for various medical reasons, he did not perform well. Up to that point, the campaign had been brilliant. The point about Napoleon was that after the physical and psychological decline, which might have been hormonal in nature, he has flashes of military genius, but they're interspersed with periods of lethargy and lassitude. And the day of Waterloo, he gets that. He's also taken too many risks, and he's up against a British and a Prussian army. He's defeated the Prussian army a few days before, but hasn't sufficiently defeated it to ensure that it isn't, at the end of the day at Waterloo, able to rejoin Wellington and seal a victory against Napoleon. In many ways, the Germans could rightly regard Waterloo as not a British victory, but as German, as a Prussian victory, because certainly the day was saved for Wellington by the late arrival that evening of the Prussian forces. But however it worked out, the French army is actually routed. It's certainly the only time Napoleon himself commanding an army is routed by his enemies, and it completely destroys his attempted comeback and his legitimacy in France.
I mean, he eventually, after this defeat, he was, as you say, sent to St. Helena, where he died in due course. It's been a fascinating discussion, because I think we're reaching the end of our program. Just in summary, I suppose, well, we could say that Napoleon was indeed a highly successful military commander who gave France a powerful empire covering large part of Europe. And just like other strong leaders, as Professor Price has mentioned, he did not know when to stop expanding his empire and making new enemies, which led to his final downfall. Many agree that his most important, influential, lasting achievement was the framing of the Napoleonic Code, which Professor Price mentioned. And in relation to to Napoleon, the well-known historian Andrew Roberts says, and I'll quote, "The ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified, and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them, he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and the arts, the abolition of feudalism, and the greatest codification of laws since the fall of the Roman Empire." Professor Price has added some wonderful insights also into the legacy of Napoleon, and I want to thank him. Thank you, Professor Munro Price. Hope you enjoyed the program as well, and hope listeners will be enlightened by this. So I think here we want to say goodbye, and we look forward to the feedback from our listeners.
It's been a great pleasure. Many thanks, Dr. Iqbal.